There's a category of organization that faces a transformation challenge unlike anything in the private sector. Standards bodies, credentialing organizations, and professional associations. These are institutions whose entire value proposition is stability, consistency, and trustworthiness. They exist because the public grants them the authority to certify, to set standards, to represent a profession, to say this person is qualified and well, this one is not. Now imagine that institution needs to transform itself. It needs to update its technology, modernize its operations, evolve its standards to reflect a changing profession or an industry. Every signal of change that the organization sends can be misread as a signal of instability by the very stakeholders who depend on it. Change your certification standards, and you risk telling every professional that you already certified that their credential is now suspect. Update your brand, and you risk telling the public that the institution they trust in is no longer the same institution. Well, today's guest has spent over 30 years navigating this exact paradox at the American Red Cross, at the American Institute of Architects, and as the Chief Operating Officer of the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards. She has seen what happens when institutional trust and organizational transformation collide. And she has learned things about the human factor that can only come from leading through it. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, along with the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Elizabeth Maza Stewart. Elizabeth is a senior advisor at 2040 Digital and one of the most frequent voices on this show. She first joined us back in season 1 for episode 3 and 4, where we explored decision-making bias and information overload. She returned for episode 7, The Vulnerability Advantage, which became and still is one of our most downloaded episodes. And earlier this season in episode 15, The Contagion Effect, we had a powerful conversation about emotional contagion, how anxiety spreads through organizations during change and transformation. We drew on the research of Hatfield, Capaccio, and Bartsay. So this is our 5th episode together. Each one has gone somewhere I didn't expect. Since that conversation, we have explored structural silence in episode 19, the broken psychological contract in episode 20, and just last week in episode 27, I did a solo episode on transformation theater, which is the pattern of performing elaborate change rituals without achieving actual change. Today's episode builds on all of those threads, but takes us somewhere none of them went. What happens when the institution responsible for setting standards for an entire profession is itself subject to the same transformation pressures it's supposed to help others navigate? Elizabeth, for listeners who haven't heard your previous episodes, give us the quick version of your background, because the range of institutions you have led is really what makes this conversation unique.
I have a strong background in quantitative and strategic analysis based on not only on my education, but also on the experiences I've had across different organizations and across different industries, whether they're B2B or B2C or charitable enterprises or associations and professional societies. So at every part of my career, which I call a circular staircase versus a ladder, I've had the opportunity to work across functions, learn from different functions, but keeping the business goals or the organizational goals and missions in mind and working towards that.
So, the combination of legal training, economic analysis, qualitative analysis, marketing practice applied across three of the most trust dependent institutions in the country. So, we're talking about CFP Board, American Red Cross, and the American Institute of Architects. So, it's the lens we need for this conversation. And for listeners who are new to the show, go back and listen to Elizabeth in season one on episode 3, 4, and 7, as well as season 2, episode 15. Those conversations set the foundation for where we're going today. So let's get into it. I want to start, with the paradox itself. So, research on institutional legitimacy, going back to DiMaggio and Powell's work on institutional isomorphism, and more recently, Deep House and Suchman's work on organizational legitimacy, shows that institutions that derive authority from perceived stability face a unique transformation challenge. The very signals of change, new leadership, new processes, new standards, can be misread by stakeholders as signals of instability. For a bank or a tech company, change signals innovation. For a standards body, change can signal unreliability. So you lived inside this paradox at three different institutions. How did you first encounter this tension between the need to transform and the need to appear stable?
So there's two parts to that question, right? How do you manage?
You know, I never ask easy questions.
Yeah, I know you don't. Well, there's two parts to that because one part of it is how do you manage change internally and how you can manage your internal change externally. Because there is that strong connection between what you do and who you serve and how you serve them, which is what the mission of the organization. So first part is as long as the mission remains stable, which is the purpose of the organization, that is pretty much your common ground across all the business units, across all the innovations, across all the activities, whether strategic, business, or operational plan. So that remains steady, and that really doesn't change as much unless the environment or there's a burning platform or anything that really changes the organization. In my experience, that mission remains stable when it's met cross, CFP board, or AIA. The second part of it is even if the mission remains stable and purposeful and constant, the way the organization delivers on that mission has to evolve. For the simple reason that environment changes, customers change, personnel change, the generational changes. So you have to be adaptable and resilient in order to be able to manage all those changes and transformation while keeping the mission as your North Star. And often the challenge that most organizations have is that they forget about the mission. And more importantly, they also forget about what the brand promise is to their stakeholders. And not in addition to the mission, brand commitment, what your brand means to the stakeholders, internal or external matters. Because they're mostly generally aligning what the mission is. So if there's a disconnect between your brand and your mission, there's going to be a disconnect between your internal stakeholders as well as your external stakeholders. So change does not happen efficiently or timely for that matter.
So and you and I have talked a lot about this. And Erin Fuller, when she was on the show a few weeks ago, talked a lot about the challenge and value proposition as well as brand distinction. So you're describing a situation where the external brand promise, the thing that the public believes about the institution, creates constraints on what an institution can do internally sometimes. Well,
Yes.
the public doesn't want to hear that the Red Cross is going through a transformation. They want to hear that the Red Cross will be there when the hurricane hits.
Yeah.
So talk about that Is public
So
instability or that perception.
I'll give you a very real example. In the 1990s, there was this whole HIV/AIDS crisis. And a big part of that crisis was due also to tainted blood, which you receive surgery or sometimes when you give blood. And that also results in blood being transfused or tainted blood being transfused to patients. So there was a huge outcry, lots of litigation, lots of adverse publicity about the Red Cross. Now, operationally, Red Cross was compliant with all FDA regulations. I mean, they practice good manufacturing practices. They pretty much manage the blood collection and distribution the way other blood banks do. But because the brand has a higher or purposeful meaning to stakeholders, they were subject to a higher scrutiny. So compliance wasn't enough. The brand promised us you're going to have to help save lives, not, cause the death of people. So that really created a burning platform internally. Some heads rolled, of course, because at that time that was the way Red Cross reacted. But there was also a conscious determination to rethink the way we operate and the way we communicate and aligning the internal initiative with external expectations.
So that focuses in on what research calls a dual audience. And you've hit on the internal reaction. So when that internal workforce, and to your earlier point, when there's a change already occurring in the organization, but then there's the reaction to what the external audience perceives. And to your point, good manufacturing practices, so forth and so on. And the public may not be resonating with that, or they may not understand that. So, given that those two audiences in many ways have fundamentally different needs and perceptions, and the internal audience needs honesty about what is changing and why, and the external audience needs reassurance that the things they depend on are not at risk. How do you communicate authentically to both at the same time?
Well, this is where I was very fortunate that Mrs. Dole created a strategic marketing function really relies on data and evidence to make business decisions. And fortunate enough to be put in a position that one of the things I had to do was determine what really is the brand promise across the enterprise. Not many people know that Red Cross revenues were really generated by the biomedical services part. At that time, it was $2 billion organization. 1.2 was biomedical, and the rest were health and safety, and then fundraising. So we were very operationally focused, and I think that was the problem. We did well in what we do, but it wasn't the external stakeholders, whether you're donors or a patient or a disaster relief flight, they don't care how well you do. They care, as you very well know, about the outcome and how it benefits or affects them. So one of the initiatives I have to do was really determine what the collective promise is across all business units, across all services. And it boiled down to helping to save lives, which we all know. I mean, stakeholders know that's what they expect, but the organization wasn't willing to coalesce around it primarily for one operational reasons, and the other was litigation. Lawyers always come into play. I was fortunate. I'm a lawyer, so I was able to play them. But it's like, we make a promise that will help save lives. We're not saying we're saving lives. So now I go to biomedical services. And they say, we're not saving lives because 90% of the patients who receive red blood cells die within 6 months. Because they're mostly ER patients, they're cancer patients, and they need red blood cells for therapy. And then you go to disaster relief services and they say, we don't save lives, we just have a contract with FEMA to provide accommodations. Or you go to health and safety services and they say, we're not here to save lives, we're here to train people to do CPR. first aid. So now I tell paramedical, yes, but you gave them 6 months, which they would not have had if you were not helping to save a life. I go to disaster relief services and I'm saying, if you didn't provide accommodation, then they're exposed to the disaster, which of course is going to impact their health and safety and welfare. And then I go to health and safety services and I say, if you don't train first aid and CPR to corporations, then if one of the employees or even the CEO collapse, who's going to do CPR to save a life? And so they were like, oh, okay, now that you put in that context, we get it. It's the outcome. What you do is great. You can focus on that. But at the end of the day, you're trying to prevent death or at least minimize it. This is why Greg was when there's a crisis, I say, did anyone die? Because if anyone died, that's a crisis.
So, I mean, you hit on earlier operations. And do you think, and to your point, going around the different departments and in many ways, them missing that shared purpose, why was there a disconnect in how they are actually facilitating the saving of lives by those contracts or by the coordination, the training? Were they, what was the challenge with them on an operational side not seeing the role that they were playing?
In most organizations, especially one that's iconic, highly visible, there's always a fear of litigation or adverse public opinion because of a mistake, like the HIV/AIDS thing. So people become really fearful and they focus only on what they do and try to do it well without really thinking about the end in mind or the stakeholder in mind. Now, it doesn't mean that if they don't focus on it, work doesn't go well, but it just gives them a much more stronger motivation to be more productive, to be more diligent, because there's an end in mind. There's a person at the end of that service.
So do you see that he is, just to jump into the human factor on this, and knowing that most people, if they have embraced the mission, they have passion. And then if you do have a fear of potential legal issues because you're maybe too passionate, uh, how do you then motivate that staff to keep compelling themselves forward when there's almost an embrace of caution?
Well, this is where the lawyers really need to play a strong role. And it takes a very good lawyer to have a business mind to understand that if you become too cautious, you can't do your job well, and the output and the outcome will not be good. And so, trying to talk to our lawyers and convincing them that it's okay for us to communicate that we're really here to help save lives. The mission doesn't change. We're still elevating quicker. Now we just have to be careful how we use that value proposition. So that way it's not necessarily a legal uh, purpose. But there's very little case study, as I tell my CFP board lawyers, where people get sued for taglines or for brand promises. Because there's a way to recover from that, like what Johnson and Johnson did when they had a problem with Tylenol. You just show up and take accountability and say, we're going to fix that. That's all what people want to hear. You're going to fix it, as opposed to denying it, which Toyota did for their cars for a long time. Remember that when they had that sudden acceleration? That really ruined their brand promise because they had a brand commitment to safety. Just admit you were at fault and say, we're going to fix it. And I think that's what Elizabeth Dole did really well. When she was hit with the consent decree because of the tainted blood, she immediately went into into the organization and said, we're going to fix it. Went to Congress and said, we're going to fix it.
We've done this on the episodes that you've been a part of, the authenticity and the trust, and even going back to the vulnerability episode where we really dove into that. And being trustworthy and being authentic is not being perfect.
No.
right? People are people, and there's companies where there's people working in companies, there's people working in organizations, and they want people to be honest, to your point.
And accountable, Kevin. Accountable. Take ownership of the problem and work through the solution with others that have a stake in it. And I think you can have authenticity, but if you have authenticity, but still say, okay, I'm not going to do anything about it, it's my fault, a flag.
Yeah, very much so. So I want to go deeper into the CFP board because I think it represents a paradox in its purest form. You were actually building a lot of the operational infrastructure for an organization that was simultaneously defining and enforcing competency standards for the entire profession. So there's a concept in the research literature called the paradox of expertise and standards
Yeah.
governance. When the institution defines professional competence, needs to evolve on its own definition, it risks appearing to invalidate the professionals it has already certified. So, in episode 14 of this season, I explored the identity crisis of expertise, and that was how professionals fuse their identity with their knowledge. So, at the CFP board, you were operating at the systemic level of that same dynamic. You were not just managing individual identity threat, you were managing an entire profession's
Right.
identity. So, how did that tension between preserving the existing certification framework and evolving it to play out inside the CFP board?
So we are accredited by NCCA, the National Commission of Certifying Agencies, which require every 5 years there's a practice analysis which update competency standards, mostly if you know the body of knowledge, principal knowledge topic, and that sort of thing. And that practice analysis is a survey of all the knowledge topics among practitioners with the opportunity to update or add to them as the practitioners experience with their clients. So we have the voice of the customer being manifested through the practitioners who then fill out the practice analysis. So, for instance, in financial planning, there's a lot of financial related topics, estate planning, tax, investment, that sort of thing. And we have communication skills as one of them. But when we had the practice analysis, what came out was the need for financial advisors to have what we call soft skills, the ability to understand the client's biases, the ability to identify their own biases so they can communicate properly, communication skills, counseling skills. I mean, things that really you might makes the financial advisor more humanistic than as a pure professional delivering financial advice. So we were able to get the practice analysis, bring it back to the organization and say we have to update competency standards. But that helped the profession because employers were saying, we want this. We want financial advisors in CSB to have a very strong humanistic side to them because money is a sensitive topic. Our educators were thrilled because now they can update their curriculum and add additional knowledge topics. And many practitioners have said, yes, we hear this and we would benefit from having continuing education in this domain. I have one CFP who had told me one time, narrated to me, that in his first encounter with a client, he was very well trained in all aspects of retirement, estate, and all of that. This client couple came into the office and he had his skill ready, he's got his work cut out for him. And the first thing the client said was, I'm going to be dying of cancer and I want my wife here to be taken care of when I'm not here anymore. Well, that script went out the door for the advisor because now he has to deal with a very emotional, sensitive situation that he had to be empathetic and sympathetic because it was very painful for the clients. And those kinds of skills you need to be aware of when you're trying to do tax planning, estate planning. It can be trained, but it's good if you have some base foundation when you start work. So we were able to bridge the paradox by saying this is what our practitioners are saying that their clients want. We adapted it into our certification, both in the education examination, and then, shared it with the education provider so they can incorporate into their curricula. And employers were happy about it, and CFPs were happy about it.
So, in many ways, it connects to something that I discussed in an episode last or earlier this season on the broken contract. And so, where there is a written contract, let's call this, the CFP board standards and the certification and so forth that they get. But then what you hit on so well was that very human element that they need to embrace because they are indeed working with people. They have to find a way for those people to feel trust and in many ways respect and as well authenticity. So there's an implicit message, right?
Yes.
Or before you guys added this human dynamic to it. And I have a follow on question to that too that I want to get to. But so where every existing CFP says, hey, this is what qualified you may not be sufficient now. So it's a psychological contract violation at
Right.
the professional wide scale. And where the written contract says you met the standards, the unwritten contract says, well, once certified, your expertise is validated, but things have changed and we're compelling you in many ways to expand on that. So in the managing that messaging to that professional audience, what worked and what didn't related to the shift that the CFP board was making for the profession.
So before we made that shift, even before I came, CFP board's positioning was we're the best. Like pumping the chest, we're the best. Among financial advisors, we're the best because we're CFPs. It missed, as you said, the human element because you're only good if your clients say you're good, not because you say so, right? So we really changed our value proposition, or even our positioning to talk about we partner with you to ensure that you have a good outcome, a good financial well-being. It's you and me. It's not just me telling you what to do. It's me listening to you. It's me giving you advice and to meet some common ground where whatever I provide, service I provide to you actually improves and upgrades, if you will, your financial well-being. That's the commitment. If you're successful, then, I'm successful as financial planner.
Because and many listeners like even myself may have seen the many different CFP commercials where the intent or the flavor of that commercial is connecting the human to human. And there are some other firms, financial firms that do that really well too. And so my question is that you're managing an internal perception, right? You're moving that forward where there is the shift back on the importance of the human factor. You're then managing the professional audience, having them understand the value of that to themselves and their careers. And then the external audience. And my probably weird question is, was there any tension when the very successful campaigns that you led launched publicly from the professionals that you were too touchy feely?
Came on board, the commercial they were using, somebody fake. It was a person who was in a office situation talking to clients, and it ended up that he wasn't a financial advisor, he was a DJ. And so the messaging was, you better know who you're talking to before you give them your assets to manage or your financial plan. So when I came on board, and the CFP wasn't very much um, evident in that whole brand thing. So when I came aboard, I said, we have to differentiate the CFP professionals from other financial advisors and from other certifications because there are many. because we have to build on that and get it more ubiquitous and iconic. And once that has a share of mind, then we can dig deeper. So the first campaign I started when it was really about getting the CDP mark out there, talking about a confident financial sector, looking at the play of words of what CFP is. So that way you get this clear of mind, you remember CFP, CFP, because that's unaided awareness, right? And then the second campaign was now the next level up, which is now that you know what a CFP is, you better ask for one when you're talking about a wealth management firm or for a firm. And that's where, if you saw the advertising where, you're on a ledge, you're talking to bungee jumping, people trying to help you is not qualified, or you're talking to a doctor who's not qualified. Is well, are you qualified? And this the qualification is, are you a CFP? So then that moves up the brand. So that conversation between client and advisor was really the strategy behind it, because now we're both together and you have to trust because I have the CFP after my name. Not you have to trust, you can trust us.
Hmm. Hmm. So to add, back to the internal audience. So you were building operations from the ground up in many regards.
Not really very well down up, Kevin, because it was already there. I just improved upon it.
There was a lot that you had to fix.
Kinda, yeah.
So what was the organizational psychology like inside the CFP board? Were
Oh my goodness.
were there people, yeah, were people experiencing their own transformation anxiety? So for many
Yes,
people
yes.
that don't know Elizabeth, right, she's an incredible person to work with. She's very diligent. She will accomplish the mission, and I know that can intimidate some people who don't want change.
Well, certification was like not treated as the core business of the organization. The enforcement, well, because they have had some Wall Street Journal coverage about 1% of the advisors thematic. And so there was this whole focus again on legal issues and then ethics and enforcement. Really, and so the certification, the core business felt isolated and unappreciated. And so when I came on board and I sensed that, and we had some turnover, so we were hiring people, I was very determined, and I made it clear to everybody that this is the business of the organization, and that people in certification have a voice and will use their voice. And so I have to remind my colleagues, if you will, that we're the one bringing the revenues. We're the one certifying competency standards. Only less than 1% of advisors are problematic. The majority deliver on the promise. The majority have the trust of the clients and communities they serve. And it's a constant messaging that not only I wanted to say or I wanted to have the voice, but everybody in the certification needed to have a voice. And we also became more participative with the certification, accreditation meetings and that sort of thing. So we always seem to have a presence. And we made sure that that certification has visibility in our space, in the certification space.
So I find it so interesting because, as you and I well know, the nonprofits and associations that are doing well in a challenging economy with demographic shifting, who have a certification program, who have standards, who have some official program that is very valued by the constituency and or the public, where the public is looking for that authenticity and trust. And to share with you, so, and I spoke at the marketing and communication technology conference for ASAE a couple weeks ago, and after my morning session, I sat in one another session, and there was an organization who had created a very successful certification program. the interesting thing that they discussed was there was great tension inside the organization when they were putting this together, where other departments were concerned that this new program was going to steer revenue away from the departments. And the challenge, right, of communicating that and having the departments themselves see the more revenue for the overall organization is better for everybody.
Yes.
So it was just an interesting dynamic. I'm not sure I have a question for you, but it's,
It's always a tension among departments, whether they're revenue generating or not. And that messaging has to really come from the top. One of the challenges I had with Red Cross was that profitability was a no-no. We cannot talk about that or margin. But our leaders talked about balancing budget and margin because you can't bring a humanitarian agency to bankrupt. And so there was, as Mr. Gold used to say, and I reminded her of this when I spoke to her a few years ago, I said, you always talked about the business of the heart. The business is the operative word because you can't be humanitarian if you're bankrupt. And same with associations, professional societies, certified. You cannot be a viable enterprise if you do not focus on growth and revenue generating because the revenues as a nonprofit goes back to the membership. I mean, you don't have stakeholders. You don't have, investors per se. And I think that if there is leadership that models a behavior that all boats rise with the tide, then there's really more of a collective approach to working together. So one of the things I did when I left the Christmas, my last Christmas event there, because it was a killer year for us. We had changed the CE, the continuing education provider revenue model. We also updated our authorized provider revenue model. We did, and we regularly update our exam certification fees. But so it was a very, very good year, despite the transition. Everybody worked together to get all of that done. And I reminded the organization that the certification of professional practice could not have been that successful if IT did not help, if finance did not help, if marketing and communications did not help, so that it was a collective success and not just the success of one part of the organization, even if they're purely revenue generating. It could have happened.
mhm. So let me shift to the AIA, American Institute of Architects, because I think your work there, and I directly know some of it, illuminates a different dimension. You directed the national advertising program. You were instrumental in connecting architectural identity to public awareness. And so that included America's Favorite Architecture Initiative on Google Earth, which was a fun project during AIA's 150th anniversary. So that work was fundamentally about translating professional identity
Yes.
into public relevance, where professional identity theory, particularly the work of Ibarra and Ashford, shows us the stories institutions tell about professions create identity anchors. So those anchors can either facilitate or resist transformation, depending on where the change is perceived as evolution of what the profession means or the erosion of it. So at the AIA, you were actively shaping the story of what architecture means to the public. And personally, I know how excited you were about it. How did that work of defining professional identity intersect with the transformation pressures that the profession itself was experiencing?
So again, we started off with data. We surveyed our practitioner, and then we took the data and then turned it around and then tested it with the public. So we can then prioritize and identify, add some, delete some, to be able to come up with the 150th that we use for Google Earth and for all our communication. It was a data-driven approach. And if you notice, one of the transformation that was happening at the time was the focus on form, not a function, and not just form. I love that expression. Form follows function because there was a collective, at least among the leadership, that basically believed we need to show how facilities and buildings are used and what the outcomes are. So there was this collective determination that when we have PowerPoints about structures, there should be people there. And then our communication started talking about evidence-based design. Like, patient outcomes are better when hospitals are well designed, education scores are better when facilities are designed much better. The story around that, if you remember, we even added a video about community design because it's not just a facility, it's the community around it because it impacts not just the people using it, but the people around it. So I think it's successful because everybody coalesces around the purpose of making sure that architecture is about places and spaces where people live, work, and play. That's the takeaway.
So I think that there's something really significant with what you're describing. So, because in talking about the Red Cross, right, you talked about the professionals and in many ways having them rediscover the purpose. And the CFP board, you're managing helping a professional review their identity. You're describing that as you're seeking to redefine or educate the public about the architects and architecture. And so the institution, with your leadership and others, is constructing a professional identity. And when you construct the identity, you're also constructing the boundaries of acceptable change.
I'll give you, remember, you were there. So it was at that time about energy performance, designing structures and buildings that impact and still energy, which is one of the biggest factors for energy consumption. And we mandated, at least the president at the time said, we need to add two CEs, that's sustainability focus only. And we also had initiatives on creating sustainability related material, 50 over 50, that sort of thing. And we even came up with the large firm. We were monitoring their design. So that was a struggle. A lot of architects were complaining to me about adding the CE. Why are you adding this and so on and so forth? Because they don't practice in that space. But that league and West GBC were promoting themselves as good design, sustainable design, and it was impacting the identity of the architect as creating places and spaces that are also sustainable. And so we implemented some initiatives that were incorporated into the way we operate as a profession that over time we pretty much eliminated the CE requirement because everybody else was including that in their own education programs.
So let me bring back the emotional contagion work from episode 15. When the AIA tells the public architecture is this, and then the profession starts evolving in ways that challenge that narrative, the anxiety doesn't stay inside the profession. It leaks into the institution and it leaks into the public's perception. You surely experienced this dynamic. What did you watch for? And really, what were the signals that professional anxiety was starting to affect institutional credibility?
So one of the ways to measure, of course, is your membership numbers and participation or engagement. So if we see our convention attendees down, or if we see membership attrition high, I mean, those are the two indicators that say there is no trust with the organization, and especially if there's some economic situation that impacts that. When we had an economic crisis in 2008, 2009, remember that? We did see some membership attrition because of the payment schedule. You have to pay the local, the state, and then the national dues. But we still saw some stability in all other engagements. I mean, these people who basically gave up membership just became emeritus, but they still got on magazines. They still attended some meetings, especially local ones. So we were able to monitor that. Uh, but the financial metrics don't lie because they are realistic. They're not probabilities. So when you know your numbers are not doing well, then you have to figure out what the root cause is. And almost always that's because you're not delivering on the value proposition or there's no trust in the institution.
Hmm. So I want to go somewhere that I think is unexplored, an institutional transformation literature. It focuses in on the emotional labor, right? Because we're all human, of leading an institution where trust ultimately is the product. And you well describe three situations where ultimately there has to be trust. So, research on emotional labor, particularly Hochschild's foundational work, shows that managing the gap between felt emotions and expressed emotions is psychologically draining,
Yeah.
right? Just like our contagion episode where there's a drain on cognitive resources. In our transformation fatigue episode, in episode 9, I described emotional dissonance as well. So that's the fatigue that comes from projecting confidence while processing uncertainty. In your career, you weren't just managing your own emotional dissonance. You were managing the emotional dissonance of an entire institution. So the Red Cross needed to project confidence, as you mentioned. CFP board needed to project certainty about professional standards and that authenticity and credibility. And the AIA needed to project vitality about a profession that is under pressure. So, how did you personally manage that burden, and what did it cost?
Well, it was long hours away from the family. You know, for me, the important thing is always communicate context and be able to discern what really is important and what not as important. So when the change impacts staff and they come to me and they say this is not good and so on and so forth, I have to understand what's driving them here or that panic or that discontent. And almost always it's not understanding what the real purpose is or what the expected outcome is. So I wouldn't even say transparency, because there's certain information that has to be confidential. But you have to be open to a conversation and be able to say, I can't talk more, but here's where we are and here's where we play a big role, right? So that's one thing. The empathy with communication and understanding where they're coming from is so critical. The other part also is in terms of sharing, if you will, their pain. And I remembered in one situation, my communication staff was so disappointed and demoralized because an outside consultant hired by the CEO was criticizing their work, and specifically the website, and reporting to the board as a consultant why we're in a very not in a very good space, and it also almost indicated that we need to change staff. So I went to my staff and we went to the whole website. I mean, at least the key parts. And I said to them, because they were afraid I was new. And they said, okay. And I told them, I said, and I hate to say this is bad word. I said, I want to show the jerk that we are better than what he says. So show me what you can do. So at that moment, they knew I was on their side. And I said, I will not accept this kind of criticism from a consultant who doesn't work day to day with us. And so they did an incredible job reworking the site, reworking our communication publication, that the board was very pleased about it. But I had to share with them that it's not just your pain, it's my pain too, and I'm pissed off. So let's do better and let's show the consultant that he's wrong. And that was the battle cry.
So, yeah, so it resonates with something that I've heard from other guests on this show, and it's the idea, and it's something I've actually written about as well, that this level leadership requires you to perform a version of yourself that's not necessarily what you're actually feeling. And so that performance has a cumulative cost. In episode 27 last week, I talked about transformation theater and the organizational habit of performing change rituals without achieving change. But there's a personal version of that too.
Oh,
So
yes.
leaders performing confidence, performing certainty, performing optimism because the institution and the workforce needs it. But they have to do that even when the reality is so much more ambiguous. What are your thoughts about navigating that dynamic?
It goes back again to being open to conversations and providing the kind of empathy people need, even if you feel terrible about it. You yourself are affected by it. There was one organization, which will not be named, that there was a reorg and my job changed, right? All my functions pretty much disappeared and I was given new ones. I like the new functions and new responsibilities, but my team, the ones I had to let go to another colleague, were really disappointed and upset. And all I could say is, my door's open. You need help dealing with your new boss or doing your work? Come in and I'll figure out how to help you and you take the credit for that. But I have your back because I trained you, I helped you, I mentored you. I'm not going to give you up if you don't work for me anymore. But sometimes you resent that, like, why am I doing this person's job?
Right, right.
To mentor their own staff or to train their own staff.
So looking across all three institutions, right, the ones we focused on today, there are others that you have been a leader at. But from the Red Cross, AIA, CFP board, was there a moment where you felt the internal emotional climate was starting to affect external trust? And if so, what did that look like, and what did it do to you? Right, you're a human, right?
I, to be honest, Kevin, because we're mostly B2B, it wasn't as obvious because our job, at least our purpose was to help the profession, to help the certificants do a good job so that their clients and communities can trust them as individuals, right? Because clients don't necessarily know about the enterprise as a whole, the AIA or the CFP board. They know about the CFP in front of them. Now, the Red Cross was something different because it was such a public institution in terms of the brand and its visibility. And so when you have all this chaos happening about flood or about, disaster, you the mission compels you to be supported, to act, to go beyond duty, if you will, because now you're being called to deliver. And I think that's really what's wonderful about it, but it's also very challenging because if you're a crisis response organization, you need to start, all hands on deck, put it that way. And so physically, intellectually, emotionally, it could be a strain, but then you get your adrenaline up and you feel that you're doing something really, really good. And that's a reward in itself.
Yeah, definitely. So, and my favorite part, or what's become my favorite part, actually. So, you have more than 30 years leading at the
Yeah.
intersection of institutional trust, professional standards, organizational transformation. I want to close with a reflection question, which is my favorite one to ask. After all of that experience, what have you learned about the human factors that determine whether an institution successfully transforms while maintaining public trust? And because I never ask easy questions, and what do leaders inside organizations, and we talked a lot about professional associations, consistently get wrong about the relationship between internal change and external credibility?
It's all about people, whether they're people inside your organization or your people that you serve outside the organization or the people that your members or your can serve. Leaders focus too much on numbers, and on operations. And I think that blinds them to like, are you really doing a good job keeping your employees safe, happy, content, evolving over time with new skills so they can be more productive? Are you focus on serving your members or your constituents so they can do a better job? And that way the profession and the brand as a whole is elevated. And I think that's really what it is. When people just focus on operations and numbers and forget the human side of it, which is what drives the numbers and the operations, then it's very hard to grow. It's very hard to evolve. It's very hard to transform.
Hmm. So, E, what would you tell a CEO of an organization right now that has a board telling them to innovate, a staff that is completely exhausted, and a profession, a set of customers, a membership that are watching every move that they make?
Well, if I were to tell the board that we have to innovate, I would have to have a very strong plan and strategy to say how we're going to do it internally and externally with people as a center. You know, how do you motivate staff? How do you train staff? How do you upgrade their skill set? How do you retain them? And that goes beyond innovation. That may include benefits and compensation and lifestyle choices. But you begin with that, and then you start thinking about, okay, now if I'm a motivated, productive staff who embrace the change, how do I ensure that what we're doing delivers on the value proposition or the promise to our stakeholders, current stakeholders? And I think sometimes we forget that, people are the important factor in any organization. Really, they are.
So, and I mean, that's always so powerful. And I think each of the guests this season, and there's another coming up next week, and it's been great where that's what they've talked about is the people and the criticality of the people and the very dynamic environment of change, adding in AI and how to navigate that for an organization, profession, the public, and industry, so forth and so on. And the tactics that each have shared, as you did today, as well as the strategies back to it. So the human factor is not the soft stuff, right? And
Yeah,
you and
yeah,
I well know this. It
yes,
really,
yes.
really is the hard stuff. It's the
Mm-hmm.
thing that determines whether change and transformation and innovation initiative succeeds or produces theater, as I talked through in the episode last week. And in institutional settings that you've been a part of, the stakes are even higher because that trust extends beyond the organization to the profession and the public that it serves. So, yeah, I just want to thank you for coming back to the show, right? There's always an open door. So from decision making bias in season one to vulnerability in episode 7 to emotional contagion, which was one of my favorite episodes, episode 15, to institutional trust today. Every conversation with you opens a dimension of the human factor that I really think listeners can get from someone who has led through it at the scale and the diversity that you have. So the paradox of needing to change while needing to appear stable, the emotional labor of leading institutions where trust is a product, and the identity dynamic that operates at professional wide scale. These are forces that standard change management playbooks
Yes.
don't address, and they aren't the forces that determine the outcome. So thanks,
And
E.
and they have to be you have to be conscious of it. It's not just something that happens. You have to be sensitized to it so you can manage it and improve upon it.
Yeah.
And it's fun. It's wonderful having conversations with you, Kevin. It's we have similar experiences, philosophies, so it's always um I'm always pleased to have this conversation with you. So thank you for inviting me.
If you found today's episode valuable, here are the ways to go deeper. The institutional trust themes we discussed today connect to the full arc of season 2, and particularly to episodes 14, 15, 19, 20, and 27, where we explored identity threat, emotional contagion, structural silence, the broken contract, and transformation theater. If you haven't listened to those, this conversation will send you back to them with new eyes. Dive into the human factor method and the transformation readiness assessment, both available at transformationassessment.com. Measure the psychological factors that we discussed today, including organizational readiness, emotional climate, and identity threat. If you are leading an institution through transformation and want to know where the invisible barriers are, those are both great places to start. Subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you listen or watch podcasts and leave a rating and a comment. Share this episode with colleagues who lead standards bodies, credentialing organizations, or professional associations. The paradox Elizabeth described today is one they are living through, and having the language for it changes how you navigate it. And if you want weekly insights about transformation psychology and the human factors that determine success, subscribe to my Ideas and Innovations newsletter at 2040digital.com or on Substack. Every Thursday, I share practical frameworks and research on why change succeeds or fails. Until next time, remember, the institutions we trust the most are often the ones that find it hardest to change. Understanding why is the first step towards helping them transform without losing what makes them trustworthy in the first place. This is the Human Factor Podcast. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.